I'm just going to be focusing on 1 or 2 slides maximum. Thank you, first of all, Sarah, for the invitation. I was clearly told that I have to stick within the boundaries of 10:40, and that's that I have to lecture for a very long time, so I'm going to try not to do so. This presentation has been part of it as presenting with Sarah at a recent webinar on above the ground risks. We actually work, to just try to liaise it with a question from Nick. We actually work in those other areas which is harder to monitor. So we work in Latin America and Africa. I'm based in the US right now, but usually every week in different countries in Latin America and Africa, I'm just discovering a new world where I have to stay far away from the jurisdictions where we work. The angle to which I'm looking at right now is the angle of the rise of criminal organization, especially at the time of COVID-19. In Mexico, we're seeing in Colombia and Brazil, the rise of the activities of criminalized groups that use gold mining specifically for money laundering activities. Right now in north of Mexico, you would have the daughter of El Chapo, which is probably the most well-known drug trafficker, who has her branded masks that she offers to all the communities, and especially next to the gold mining site, to gain some allegiances and gain some influence around mining site. I will take just my perception is that it's not hard to monitor what's going on in Latin America and Africa. Everybody knows what is going on. If you take the time to ask questions, to interview, to get secondary sources, you happen to know which are the properties that actually do a standard and good of formal and are not played by criminal organization, which are actually almost a minority. And then you have, to a certain extent, depending on the size of the operations, you have the capacity to see which are the ones that are being played by, production and money laundering from production from criminal organization and different types of trafficking, whether it's human trafficking or drug trafficking. Our approach to this, what we do is that we do counterparty risk assessments and due diligence ahead of an acquisition from a mining major or from an investor. We do a lot of on the ground. We have a network of 300 people in Latin America, a little less in Africa, that we activate for a specific expertise, whether it is drug trafficking or it is criminal organization, it is different type of criminal organizations, or also general different types of above the ground risks. And that's a white paper that we published, but I just want this conceptual license. I'm conceptualized differently. I'm not claiming the right conceptualization of it. We actually looked at 7 categories of the ground risk, and obviously for this one I'm going to be focusing on safety and security, trying to look at what is the relationship between criminal organizations and regular formal mining organizations, and how these influences or these interferences can be understood, can be monitored, and then can be mitigated. And that's why you're going to see I'm going to rush directly to the safety and security slide. Have you seen a past one on local community, and we could have actually addressed this issue of sustainable supply from the angle of local community management. But here my topic is just looking at this issue. When we say security and safety, not specifically operational, we'll look at it from how unsecure levels of security concerns will impact the right development of mining operations. So on this one, for example, as I mentioned, the influence of organized criminal groups that target mining operations to extort monies out of them. We've seen several of those cases in Venezuela. We see them in Colombia and Brazil, and it's the capacity of extortion and influence depends on what is the power game around mining communities, and what is the relationship that a mining company has with local political actors, local economic actors, and often regional actors, because the bridge that you have with regional actors, whether it's the governor or it is other economic actors at the regional level, usually provides more influence or strength to try to limit the presence of criminal organizations and try to limit their capacity to try to extort money from you or influence your operations. We've seen countless operations where there's been threats from criminal organizations to say, look, you know what, ahead of your smelter, you can actually continue processing your own production, but we're just going to be filling in a certain amount of ounces in terms of our own extraction, and we demand that you actually process it at the same time, and then with a series of bribes down the road, you can actually keep it under cover, and that's how you actually put in jeopardy a sustainable supply chain of mineral in an action. The way that you can actually do it is obviously with policing forces and military forces, but there's a caveat here, in the sense that depending on the jurisdictions where you operate, whether it's Durango, Sinaloa, it is Antioquia next to Medellin, Colombia, there are different actors that you want integrating into securitization of operation. The times you want to go through a private third parties of security forces because most of the local institutional actors are being already compromised, and therefore they are being compromised by criminal organizations. Or you might want to have, in the case where you have to get any support from local political actors and you have to go through the traditional formal route of policing your concession, then you want to go through institutional actors of security. But you have to always have a certain level of protocols that makes you allowed to mitigate the risk that potentially working with compromised forces because they've been already, let's say, extorted, or they're under the influence of criminal organization, has its limitation. The second element I wanted to mention specifically is the issue of illegal mining interests. And that's where we see, usually, to be oversimplistic, we see different options in terms of address illegal miners or informal mining concession. The first one is usually to police on your concession, put a fence around it, and saying, whatever inside my concession is going to be dealt by my security forces, whatever is outside is going to be dealt by my CR team. And there's usually a lack of communication between the two. The issue here is that there is a risk about antagonizing informal miners and just pushing them away, and basically saying, until you're formalized, you don't have the capacity to work with us and maybe work on a specific deal between informal miners and the concession owner. And I can actually give more details on this. But the problem, if you do that, basically way into more into the hands of the criminal organizations. The best option usually to do, and although it's actually taking much more, it's a little more financial efforts, but much more time. And on this, always on illegal, on above the ground risk, mining companies believe it's a question of money. It's not a question of money. It's a question of time, dedication, working with empathy and understanding the concerns of the population. It is the same thing here for informal miners. And the potential benefits of formalizing those informal miners, bringing them, accepting their presence on the concession, which has a cost, but limiting their operations is obviously some areas where reserves might be less promising, might be more interesting nearer to the surface when they can actually access it, but obviously they will not compromise a deeper reserves of minerals. Is a way to go by making sure that they also follow a certain level of environmental regulations, that they follow a certain code of ethics in terms of how they operate on the concession. But that actually usually brings you to having those informal miners as being your own fence towards criminal organization, meaning that because you actually treated them respectfully and try to give them a perspective of how you formalize them, it's actually very complicated, of course, because usually informal miners are not 9 to 5 kind of 9 to 5 kind of people. I'm not going to stereotype them, but there's money burns and is really being spent in different ways just after finding gold, of being able to actually get the money from it. So there's a lot of work of education and trying to be able to put them inside process of that are closer to the traditional formal ways of mining. But if it is done in a good way, in a mid-term to long term, they will become your own protection towards criminal organization. The port of entry to a community, which is all for informal miners, will side company rather with the criminal actors, because they also know of the risks of working with criminal actors. They usually more money if they're being well formalized. The time of COVID-19 right now is exceptional to encourage for formalization of activities, because if you're not formal, if you don't exist, in fact, then you will not get any kind of support from whether the state, the governorship, to the alcaldía, the township. And although a lot of this support will be limited, there is a push towards being part of those of this formalization process, because you are accounted for. If there's a health issue specifically, there will be you'll be addressed to, and you will actually be part of the process to try to recover any kind of pandemics. There's a push there. That's why we believe it's very important to continue, despite the cut of budgets, continue formalizing those informal miners and not antagonize it. Then it costs less money, police, the concession, to push away any kind of people that can disrupt normal operations of the mine, especially in terms of COVID-19, that you don't want to compromise it with other people coming from outside. So the tendency of large fence, really, this will cost you in the long run. Another element, obviously, which is important is guerrilla and civil warfare. So, like blood diamonds, but when looking at gold, if it's actually being coming from different regions where you have paramilitary activity. I'm thinking about Ivar or Nariño in Colombia. I'm thinking about a series of areas in northern Brazil where you have some local guerrillas and guerimperos. I'm thinking about a bunch of different African countries. Sorry, I had too long to list them. But the idea here is really to work, hand in hand with the government to try to put mining as one of the pillars for negotiation of peace talks. What do I mean by this? Obviously, peace talks is not based only on the interests of mining, but just to try to raise to the attention that mining or oil, when it comes to Middle Eastern terrorist groups or others, are the main source of funding of their activity. So if you want to securitize and make sure that the peace has a chance, or at least an improvement of this conflict, the mining and reserves and the gold reserves especially, or diamond reserves, become suddenly a strategic asset that you need to securitize first. And by doing this, then you actually are able to delimitate clearly which are the areas that will be considered as sustainable source of supplies, as opposition to other areas that might be more compromised with the operation guerrillas and paramilitary. But often in case, those mining interests that can be at times, in the hands of concessions of junior miners in the civil Canada, but usually interests a lesser influence into the defining of what could be the security military strategy to a series of territory, in the sense that usually they're more influenced by a whole, wealthy family or local political actor that will have an influence of the defense forces towards one direction and not into account a foreign investment in the mining sector. That's why there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that this idea of securitization of concession is one of the priorities, so that you can actually clarify, for us, the sustainable supply sources, but also you can cut down the source of funding for potential guerrillas groups. So I just want to, just between organized ground, guerrillas, and illegal mining, informal mining interests, those are three elements that compromises the sustainable supply chains. And there are some best practices to address them from different properties. And then I will answer more questions down now. If not, we'll continue talking forever.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much for that fantastic overview there, Remi. And yep, we're all giving you a round of applause from behind our microphones around the world. Just as these questions come in, and I can see there's some really interesting chatter that's going on here, you describe incredibly complex situations that obviously have the potential to change really, really quickly. Are you seeing any of those different aspects you mentioned just now changing really fast as a result of COVID-19?
So there's two things. First of all, and I didn't know you were going to end the question with COVID-19. I was, more the evolution before COVID-19, because still, we've seen a clear interest both from mining majors, but also investors, in terms of understanding the potential security risk, obviously, which is the compromising the production, but taking from a different angle, and more of reputation. And that is more in line potentially with issues of making sure that supply chains remain sustainable and uncompromised. It's not a question of volumes, okay, or profit margin. It's a question of a series of different issues as taken precedence on international agenda, in the news. I mean, my best allies, to be honest with you, are the anti-mining interests. My best allies are the green NGOs, anti-mining interests that will raise these issues. And then obviously there's ways to make the case that mining is actually building towards value creation and that supports from the government actors, but they forced investors to look much more closely at how compromised some of their the activities that they're found are. So that not only goes into sustainable supply chains, but it's much more into the drug trafficking, environmental concerns, and others. But in there is potentially being linked with criminal organization or criminal states. I mean, we were probably, I don't want to claim too much, but we were part of the reason why Barrick didn't go to Venezuela to start with, because that would have been a terrible idea. And that's a clear example of how, they would have been in the supply for a large group would have been tainting an legitimate regime, one that takes money as a way to finance, criminal activity in the country. But that's why we've seen this shift. In terms of COVID-19 on this, we do see a shift which is actually more negative unfortunately. COVID-19 impact on developing countries' jurisdictions is more seen from population because of the incapacity of states to actually react to it and provide security or masks or any kind of clear protocol or health support to the population. That's actually not as bad as we think in terms of hospitals. Infrastructure is there. Obviously, in remote areas, which is where usually mining sites are locating, in remote areas, that's where you have less so of social infrastructure. And in recent years, unfortunately, mining companies use their CSR budget for larger infrastructure, such as roads or electricity, which makes sense, but as it has helped the state, or maybe it's not the role of the company, but have hospitals or schools from time to time because it's popular, that must be left on the side. And the issue is the lack of from communities where the criminal organization are stepping in, whether it's like Amora in Mali, in every country, seeing like a stepping up of criminal organization that say, well, the state is not here for you. By the way, I do have those liquidities for your business. Shady liquidities. It's called money laundering, but you can continue working. So we are very much concerned about the staggering rise in security risk, especially among local communities, informal mining communities around mining sites. And that's why we spend our time just calling our partners saying, don't decrease, don't, continue with your team, continue with communication through radio, through something, but just don't move away from communities because while there's COVID-19, you have your corporate protocols and others, because the criminal organization, they do not care about social distancing, or maybe just, coming at 2 meters is fine. There's protocols from companies that come out of side, or they should stay at home. And at the end of the day, there's a vacuum of criminal organizations are really taking advantage of.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Remi.